Continuing on from the dresser in my last video, again, I wanted to make as much of this project as possible from materials I already had, and I ended up having enough offcuts, leftovers and scraps to build it without having to go to the store. I started by milling down these pine packing battens for the legs. I cleaned off one face and one edge on the jointer and milled the other edge parallel with the thicknesser. I ripped the boards down the middle and then used those milled edges against the fence to rip each leg down to width. I then cut a taper on two inside faces of each leg at one end using a tapering jig. I made sure to label the top of each leg so I didn't get them mixed up. The sides of the bedside table are made by joining two legs together with rails, which I cut off camera from more leftovers. I labelled all the joints to hopefully avoid any mistakes and drilled the holes for the dowel joinery using my Dowelmax. Each joint was going to have two staggered dowels, and because the Dowelmax works by always referencing the same face, I drilled one of the holes first in each leg and rail, and then reconfigured the jig with spacers to drill the second hole at each joint. With each side frame clamped together in a dry fit, I cut slots on the inside of the void for biscuits, which I used to fix the insert panels. I chose to do it this way because the insert panels are so small, it was easier than cutting a rebate all the way around that void. Just as I did with the dresser, when the MDF panel is inserted into the side frame, there's a seam between the two, and rather than trying to hide it or leaving it as is, I chamfered the outside edge of the panel and the inside edge of the frame to accentuate that joint, and it's one of those subtle little details that make a big difference in a piece of furniture. It was time to glue up the sides of the table, so I sanded the inside faces first while I could get to them. I did the glue up in stages, starting with one leg and the top rail only, to set that at the perfect angle using the infill panel as a guide. Once they were set, I finished off the rest of the glue up. I tried to only apply glue to the inside of the edges of the infill panel so I wouldn't get any squeeze out in the show side of the seam, and it worked out great. Just had a few small dabs in the corners. The side panels then had a stop rebate cut into the back of them for the back panel, and I used marks on the router table to know where to stop and start the cuts. After that, it was time to join the two sides together to make the main carcass of the bedside table, and I used dowels again for easy, accurate, strong joints. The front rail was set back from the front of the table for an inset drawer front, and the rear rails were set back to line up with the rebate. Once the carcass was done, I spent a little bit of quiet time chamfering the sharp corners of the legs with a block plane. Next part to make was the top. The boards for the top went through the usual process of cutting and milling before being glued up into a panel. This bit doesn't really need my explanation, so just enjoy the sounds of the workshop. After the panel had dried, I scraped off the glue squeeze out, ran it through the drum sander and cut it to final width on the table saw. Next was the drawer, and I started with the drawer front, cutting it down to size from this piece of MDF. Perfect fit. I then cut the moulding pieces for the drawer front, and it was nice to only have to do this for one drawer, although I was an expert now, having done this for the dresser which had 7 drawers. Each piece of moulding was marked directly off the drawer front to get a perfect fit. Seems like I miscalculated somewhere and the drawer runners weren't going to be set back enough for the inset drawer front, so I notched out the rear cross rail and it was all good. I then installed the drawer runners and took a measurement for the drawer box, which I made next. I cut all the pieces from leftover melamine, first making a score cut on the underside to eliminate chipping out the melamine when cutting all the way through. I'll put a link to my earlier pantry video at the end of this video and down below, which includes a lot more detail about how I make these drawers. edge banded all the exposed edges that would be seen and then assembled the drawer box with screws. With the drawer in place, I could then do a final fit of the drawer front and screw that in place. Next part to make was a lower shelf, which was the same process as the top. The shelf is fixed to the legs just above the tapered sections, so I marked cutouts on each corner and cut them out on the table saw. With the top of the board facing up and the blade in the saw raised, I could cut right up to the lines. The small amount of overcutting on the underside of the shelf won't be seen. And because the underside won't be seen, pocket holes were perfect for joining the shelf to the legs. When screwing the shelf in place, I used a spacer block to make sure it didn't shift out of alignment. Time for finish. My daughter chose classic white for the bedside table, so I sprayed on a sealer primer coat first before applying the final top coats of white paint. Once the paint was dry, I drilled screw holes and added some figure 8 brackets for the top, and it was time for final assembly.